Hello, I'm Andrew Kidd. I'm a former civil servant. I was based in Kabul 2008 to 2011. Retired, took early retirement, and stayed in touch with former colleagues, etc. Like many of my former civil servant and diplomatic colleagues did, we came together in August 2021 as the Afghanistan Diplomatic and Development Alliance to really try and support our former colleagues and advocate on their behalf.
Thank you. Nicola.
I'm Nicola Kelly. I'm a freelance journalist. I tend to write for The Guardian, Observer, The Independent and others.
Thank you. Fawzia.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Fawzia Kufi. I was a member of parliament in Afghanistan for 15 years. Deputy Speaker of Parliament. I was also in the peace negotiation team representing Islamic Republic of Afghanistan in the negotiation with the Taliban. Since fleeing Afghanistan, I continue my activism and advocacy for the people of Afghanistan. And currently I am the president of Women for Afghanistan. It's a movement that we try to mobilize women in support of Afghanistan and the people of Afghanistan.
Thank you all ever so much for joining us. I think it would be difficult for us to start without recognising the appalling impact of the earthquakes that have taken place in Afghanistan over the very short recent period. It is horrifying to see a country face so many natural disasters in such swift and quick succession. And Fawzia, I hope that all of your loved ones have been able to remain safe and haven't been affected by that. Can I start by asking the question that many don't wish to discuss, which is how do we engage the Taliban going forward? What should be the nature of the UK's relationship? And how do we make sure that we are able to advocate in the best interests of not only people in Afghanistan, but actually within the wider geopolitical region? I don't know, Fawzia, if you want to kick us off.
Once again, thank you, Madam, for the opportunity. And we appreciate your persistent position over very tricky issues of international and foreign policy. So the world has been engaged with the Taliban since they have returned to power, and the failure of the Doha Agreement that actually paved the way for Taliban return to power mainly on three issues. First is the human rights issue. Second is the humanitarian issue. And third is the political dialogue and the peace process. On the human rights issue, as you know, the country is suffering from the worst and the severe human rights violation. Taliban continue to arbitrarily detain people, women protesters, their political oppositions, journalists, activists. Recently, like since 1 week, as the world attention has been shifted to another conflict, they continue to increase their arrest of education activists and my friends who are across the country. The human rights organizations, the UN and the Special Rapporteur produce report on the situation of the severe human rights in Afghanistan. Their reports are accurate, but they are not comprehensive because they do not have the means to access across Afghanistan. The human rights organization in different places in Afghanistan cannot operate. Media is obviously censored. So the reports are important, but there has been no action on the outcome of the reports. I suggest that there should be a strengthened accountability mechanism by the international community. I suggest that the world must recognize the term apartheid because all the incidents indicate that there is a gender apartheid happening in Afghanistan, amounting the crimes against humanity. I believe as I was negotiating with Taliban, I think Taliban will respond to pressure. And so there should be a principled engagement in terms of clear indication of what do you get as a result of the engagement. I have a few more points, which I will speak when times come.
Thank you. Andrew.
It's a very difficult one, I think. I'm still in touch with former colleagues in Afghanistan who are still being hunted by the Taliban, former FCDO colleagues. So to kind of try and liaise with the Taliban in that context, recognizing that they're still behaving in that way, I think is going to be extremely difficult for the Foreign Office. I think the point about multilateralism is really important, really key, that I think coming together as an international community, recognizing the the humanitarian situation is very key. Whether the UK could do more with the regional neighbours, use its diplomatic effort to actually, but whether the Taliban would actually be amenable to some of those engagement with regional neighbours is, I would say, is questionable.
Thank you. And Nicola, before I go to Graham.
My focus is on resettlement, on UK immigration and asylum, so I would say the main focus is speeding up processing. It's been far too slow. Only 66 individuals resettle through Pathway 2 of the ACRS and only 41 through Pathway 3. And improving the quality of decision making so decisions get made a lot faster and people can be brought to the UK.
Thank you. Graham.
Just specifically on the humanitarian situation, when we've had witnesses here before, they've told us that there has been food available at a price often that people couldn't afford. What is the situation now in terms of food availability and its price?
Okay. So, thank you, sir. Under the Taliban, Afghanistan has become one of the dire humanitarian crises in the world. Afghanistan is a rich country but poor people. My heart trench as somebody who wanted to represent a different country, a country that actually have a more economic prosperity, to hear and get calls from people on the ground who only two years back had a very prestigious life and a life with dignity. Now they're struggling with $20 or less income per month. Taliban have a good division of labor, sir. They want the international community to feed the people of Afghanistan as they continue to have agreements and contracts right and left with neighboring countries in the region. And that leaves people of Afghanistan in dire situation of humanitarian need. The World Bank report indicates that there is an increase in the income per capita, which unfortunately from my perspective it's not accurate because the World Bank does not have access to the ordinary people to collect the data. So in terms of the humanitarian situation, we know that humanitarian aid organizations are not allowed to hire women. That leave 70 million women in need of basic income. For instance, you mentioned, Madam, the unfortunate earthquake that happened last week, costing almost 2,500 lives in Herat province, Zindajan, and some other districts. Women were not allowed, and women were basically the main victim because they were in the homes. They are not allowed to get out of their homes when the earthquake happened. So they lost their lives, the children lost their lives, and and they became the victim basically. Women who should be part of the humanitarian aid cannot access these families because they are not allowed to work. So as it is very difficult, I cannot lobby for a deduction of humanitarian aid because I think women-led organizations in Afghanistan who provide humanitarian aid are the only source of income at this stage for 17 million plus women in Afghanistan. So what I would like to suggest is definitely the humanitarian aid actually supported Taliban. It empowered them. There are credible reports based on my contacts from Afghanistan that Taliban have access to, and they try to support their soldiers and their people first before giving aid to the people, to the ordinary people in need. But I would like to suggest for a continuation of humanitarian aid, especially with a focus on two things. First of all, on establishing a strong monitoring mechanism to ensure that the aid actually reaches the people, because we do not have a monitoring mechanism. $2.8 billion was spent in the last 2 years on humanitarian aid in Afghanistan. There is no monitoring mechanism. We don't know where the money actually is gone, how much of that benefited Taliban. The second recommendation I would like to make is make the procedure simpler for women-led organizations. Those organizations who actually provide aid to the women involved in civic activism, we need to make the procedure easier for them so that they access aid, they access the money, because they find their way. As the space is limited for them, they find their way to operate in different parts of Afghanistan. So we need to make sure that international organizations like the UN or any other donor on the ground make it simpler for these organizations to access, because they are the only source of job for women.
Andrew, Nicola, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, my former colleagues who worked for the FCDO who are still in Afghanistan, or those who work directly in association with the UK, are really struggling. That's you've got a broad-scale humanitarian issue, as Fawzia has mentioned, but they're still being hunted. They're in hiding. They're having to move from house to house. They're separating their families to manage the threat. They're unable to get jobs. They're having to sell all of their assets to survive. So, you know, the Foreign Office has abandoned its former employees and those that worked with who work directly with the UK. So that group is really suffering.
And is there food available?
But there is no money.
So if people sell their assets, they can go and buy food?
You can at a price, yeah.
The price, yeah.
Price is very high.
Just a final question, because we're pressed for time. How stable is the regime in this situation?
I think it's, from the outside, it looks stable enough to want to still hunt those who it has a long memory worked as what they would say foreign agents. It's sufficiently stable to want to still hunt those individuals.
However, sir, if I may, there is further division among Taliban that could be used as a lever. I believe, as a political theory as well, there is no government that could last very long on the basis of exclusion. What Taliban do is they do not only exclude the rest of community, women, but everybody from participating in the government. So basically it's a government of Taliban, for Taliban, by Taliban. No government will run on the basis of exclusion. And they claim that they have brought security to Afghanistan. We all know that security is not just the absence of war. Security is when people feel safe in their homes, which they do not. And in their fight against military extremism, like Daesh and ISIS-K, others, they actually have been convenient with their military strategy. They are hunting their military, their opposition, political opposition, former security forces under the name of Daesh, and they sell it to the world as we are the only group that will encounter other military extremist groups. From my experience living in Afghanistan all my life, no military extremist group actually will be able to encounter other one. In fact, Taliban have inspired many military extremist groups in the region. Now there are 25 military extremist groups, including Daesh, Al-Qaeda, that work between Afghanistan and Central Asia and South Asia, which could endanger the global security in long term if we do not really look at beyond humanitarian aid and human rights with a political view.
Thank you.
Bob, then Brendan.
Just very briefly, a parliamentarian called Tobias Elwood, who was chair of the Defence Committee, went to Afghanistan earlier this year and said it was a country transformed. He certainly, when it came to production of poppies and basic security, I mean, I respect his right to have an opinion. I'm not saying he was right or wrong. I just want to ask you if you felt that he was right in his comments, or if those comments were wrong and it wasn't a country transformed, or it was a country transformed, but not in a positive way. So can I just have a quick answer from all three of you? Fawzia, what do you think?
Sir, how can a country be transformed when 17 million population, female gender, are deprived of participating in any kind of social, political, economical sphere? The country has $3 billion deficit because women has not participated in, in job market. How can it be, prosperous and transformed when the prisons are full of women protesters and men who actually speak against the Taliban? As I said, it's a government of Taliban, by Taliban, for Taliban. Obviously, when the foreign diplomats go to Afghanistan, the Taliban welcome it and they try to provide them security and take them to where they want to, like an escorted mission. And they try to superficially make it look nice for the international community. When they say we counter corruption, there is no money. With the food, the humanitarian aid, there is a lot of corruption Taliban Taliban do that. If there is more money, there is more corruption. So what the Taliban claim that they're fighting corruption and economy has transformed is a false claim. And in fact, I think when I say principled engagement, like these are the basic things we want the foreign diplomats when they go to Afghanistan, including, you know, the MP from the UK government, the MPs to look at, like, you know, has they really committed anything when they promised during negotiation in Doha in terms of human rights? In fact, it has gotten worse. Afghanistan is the worst country for women and its citizens, and you know that. Women are not only banned from education, from work, but from breathing. And my sisters from Afghanistan, sir, tell me that maybe if there is a lack of oxygen, Taliban will tell us to stop breathing. So what I'm telling you is there should be certain principles. We do not campaign for disengagement. What we're asking is there should be a set of principles that you could monitor. And those principles do not exist. That's why everybody presents their own views.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the people I speak to who are in Afghanistan are in hiding. As Andrew says, they're like fugitives. They're moving from house to house. They're trying to get internet access. If we're talking about resettlement schemes, they try to get the forms, the websites crash, data gets leaked, forms get lost. Meanwhile, while they're waiting for a response from the British government to their applications, they're being kidnapped, tortured and killed. For some of my reporting, I spoke to a man called Bator, who worked for the British Council for many years. His daughter, who's 2 years old, was taken sick, Najwa. He had had death threats against him. He was unable to leave his house. When the situation deteriorated and her health got a lot worse, they then had to move to the hospital. By the time they arrived at the hospital, she had died of liver failure and cardiac arrest. Had she arrived at the hospital sooner, she might have lived, but probably even more likely, if she had been resettled in the UK, then they would all be alive.
Andrew.
So those who worked with the UK, it's been transformed into a hellhole for them. As we said, they're moving house to house. They're worried about their own lives.
Yeah, but not just about the UK, because I know we're going to come to that again. To society overall, you don't think it's society transformed in a good way?
Well, people feel at risk and vulnerable, you know, so there are many different types of groups who feel at risk and vulnerable. And, you know, I'm particularly concerned with those I used to work with and were employed by HMG.
Thank you. Brendan.
Thank you.
It's kind of following on from what Bob said, and it's about the situation of women and girls in Afghanistan. A recent report from the International Bar Association Human Rights Institute talked about the normalisation of oppression and the erosion of women's human rights. Given that, and given what you said earlier, what can the UK do to help? What should it be doing that it's not doing to better support women and girls in Afghanistan?
Thank you, sir. There are a few recommendations suggestions I would like to bring before the committee. First of all, as I said, the international community must continue to support women-led and women-led organizations that still operate in Afghanistan in urban and rural areas. This is the first thing. Second, yes, what is happening in Afghanistan by no norm is the normal. Unfortunately, I see that a lot of international commentators, and even in a meeting that was held during September at FCDU, there were some talks about, you know, kind of sending girls to madrasa and recognize madrasa as an alternative to official school system. We know that, first of all, madrasa only accept girls until age 13. Second, their curricula is radicalized curricula. Third, it is not inclusive to religious minorities. Fourth, it actually embraces military act including suicide bombing. And why do we think in 21st century it is okay, it's normal for women not to go to formal education system? Taliban know that an educated mother will never allow her son to pick up a gun and pursue his political career through violence. That's why they want to have a generation of Taliban in the future, and they have actually chosen their war against women very carefully. So I think what could you do is do not accept the exceptionally imposed restriction of Taliban. A political process is the response. So without changing the political ecosystem, trying to see how we can find our way within the current status quo is not going to be helpful. Pursuing a political process is something Taliban promised in the Doha negotiation. And this is one of the 4 elements of the Doha agreement. American troops withdrawal is the first. A political process is the second and the main element. Now, if that is a legal valid document, the signatories must hold Taliban accountable for a political process, which will result in an inclusive government. And we, the women in exile and in Afghanistan, have now initiated a women-centric civic and peace process. We hope your support and your government support to creating an alternative space to the current crisis in Afghanistan.
And so widening that out to the other members of the panel, does the UK government have leverage that it could exercise to do this?
I don't think if it has leverage, it's using it effectively. Is it using its diplomatic network in the region effectively? You know, I talk to my former colleagues in the FCDO, and it feels as if that kind of network of ambassadors, you know, being aligned to actually get behind a policy agenda and make change, because change is not only going to come from individual engagement, it's going to have to be a regional multilateral approach. That just feels like it's been eroded as a skill set.
And so one final question about the needs of women in Afghanistan and the gender apartheid you talked about. Do they differ from the needs of Afghan women in the diaspora, those Afghan women who are no longer in Afghanistan? Are they being talked about enough? Are their needs being recognised, and what are those needs?
Thank you, sir, for the very important question. We actually call ourselves Women in Exile because we hope that we will in the near future, all our struggles are to go back to our country and make our country look like the Great Britain. In terms of the needs, obviously, women who are in Afghanistan face the catastrophe. They suffer the most because, as I said before, in my daily contact, almost 80% of my time is still with women in Afghanistan, inside the country, and trying to support them whatever way I can. As I said before, they're like, we start our day looking at the walls of our home and end it that way. Only those women who are there will understand what does that mean. And I would like to invite you to put your feet in the shoes of those people. If UK was to suppress the men in this country, not to go to work and education, how would that feel? If women of Afghanistan were not women, and if they belong to a religious group, how would the world react? We should not think that women of Afghanistan deserve that. Women who are in exile, they still continue to amplify the voices of women in Afghanistan. I think the UK government must adopt a provision to support them because they are talents of Afghanistan. They are brains of Afghanistan. As you mentioned, not only women, the men who are in your country, they have been part of the progress of their country only two years ago. They have been part of the change in their country. You have invested your blood and treasure to empower them. The British troops lost their lives in Afghanistan. To empower this generation of empowered Afghans, you need to support them here, adopt certain provision as the United States adopted. You know, we are not here just as a refugee. We were not in search of a better life. We were forced to flee our country. So the United States adopted certain procedures to give these women and the men the platform to be part of the society in their capacity, but continue to still work for what is best for their original country. So I think those kind of policies should be adopted for the women who are in the UK, for instance, and the men as well.
Thank you. Can I bring in Neil?
Thanks, Chair. Just quickly, can I thank you, Fazi, for your continued advocacy for Afghan women and girls? It's hugely important, and I've seen it both for the work you do for those still in Afghanistan, but those Afghans here in London in Southwark last year at the Nowruz Festival. But linked to your point about Doha and the role of Taliban, the Qataris wanted to be playing a role of broker and believed they could influence what the Taliban would do. And they said they would bring together international Muslim clerics and academics to try and exert some influence over what the Taliban then did in government. Is there any evidence at all, I fear not, but is there any evidence at all that the Qataris have had any influence, positive influence, over what the Taliban have done? And is there any other external actor who does have a stronger role they could play to influence the Taliban?
I guess the Muslim majority countries have a role because obviously what Taliban do is, in the first place, they actually misrepresent our religion. under the name of religion, they try to do things that actually contradicts religion. For instance, the first verse in our religion is about reading, about Iqra, means read. But Taliban actually stopped 50% of the population from reading under the name of the same religion. And that's why the OIC, the member states, countries in the region, the neighboring countries, have a much bigger role to play before Taliban further create Islamophobia. And that's why I think Qataris try to play a catalyst role, and their role, like many other Muslim countries, are very, very important in countering the Taliban's narrative of Islam. However, in terms of the impact, we know that nothing has changed. In fact, things got worse on the ground. They only allow women to go to schools up to grade 6. Many people, when they go to grade 6 and they don't see any future, they stop their girls to go to continue their education until grade 6 because there is no work and there is nothing else. And that actually increased child marriages, forced marriages, mental health. So it's not only one element. There is a vicious circle of what's Taliban doing on women in terms of their life. And I think the OIC member state must really be more vocal. They recently sent a delegation of Muslim scholars to Afghanistan, and there has been no outcome of what they have negotiated with Taliban.
Liam, please.
Yes, Andrew, could I ask you to just describe the cross-government coordination on settlement schemes and the broader response? Because when we were pulling this session together, the Foreign Office said that the Home Office needed to be alongside. The Home Office was approached, but they said the topics fell to the Foreign Office, the MOD and the Department for Levelling Up, coordinated by the Cabinet Office. Levelling Up Department was then approached, but they said it was the Home Office's job, and the Home Office said that these topics were not the Home Office responsibility. It sounds like an episode of Yes Minister, but it's not funny. And how would you describe it?
I think you summed up the complexity of coordination. I mean, there is ongoing failures in coordination between government departments. I mean, I'll give you one example that touches my heart very closely. Former Foreign Office employees who should fit with Arab Category 2, which is the policy is under the MOD and operationalized under the MOD. July 2021, a former colleague was rejected because he wasn't directly employed by HMG. He was a Foreign Office employee. Did the MOD check with the Foreign Office? Don't know. He went into appeal in August 2021 and is still yet to hear anything from Arab. Now, there's another case just rejected, former DFID employee, program officer, publicly exposed role, meaningful and significant to the UK mission, rejected in August 2023, this last August. Fits perfectly with Arab Category 2. Did the MOD speak to the Foreign Office about that case? Another case applied January 2022, still hasn't heard anything. Now, those three cases, we had August last year, our group had a consultation with the Foreign Office about the future of the ACRS, Pathway 3, what to come. They wanted to consult, they wanted to listen. And I took that opportunity to share with them those cases and sent them a grid of 10 former HMG employees who still were yet to get a response from Arab. They said, we'd get back to you. Nothing.
Sounds shambolic. Is that
Nothing.
too strong?
In fact, I thought, well, okay, to be fair, maybe they don't want to engage with third parties. So I actually copied in those Afghans to their former employee, the FCDO. They got back nothing. So that coordination between the MOD and the Foreign Office, in those that the Foreign Office should be most concerned about, its foreign employees, has just failed woefully.
Can I add? The committee said that the mismanagement was completely inexcusable. When I was reporting on this, I found there were only 8 staff within the FCDO working on the ACRS, 8, in comparison to 540 working from across Whitehall on the Ukrainian schemes.
You've said that the resettlement schemes are too narrow, they're lacking in transparency, they're inconsistently applied. I think we've got well under 10,000 who have come in on one of the 3 pathways. The commitment was obviously 20,000, but we've got 30,216 people who are still awaiting a decision. Can you just say why you came to that judgment about the structure of the schemes being just too narrow?
I think it's a number of different factors. The under-resourcing is one, the way in which it's been administered is another, and the lines of communication is another. As we're talking about, the coordination has been particularly poor. People came to me, a journalist, rather than going to any other source of information, because they were completely unclear as to which pathway they should apply for. Some people applied for both because they had applied for ARAP. They then said, oh, I think I should probably apply for ACRS as well. They didn't know which pathway they fell into as well. So some fell into, the figures are always slightly fudged when I talk to the Home Office, and you've alluded to the ways in which this is kind of ping-ponged around different government departments. The Home Office consistently say, we've brought 21,000 people over. This figure is, when interrogated, could be said that a number of those people came over under ARAP before, during, and shortly after Operation Pitting. Then a number of people were brought over under Pathway 1 of the ACRS. But the numbers for Pathway 2 and 3 are negligible. 66 individuals under Pathway 2, 41 under Pathway 3. It's completely stalled. And meanwhile, as I say, people are dying. And actually, they are being forced to take small boats because there is no other routes. The safe routes have completely closed now. So people who are ACRS and ARAP eligible are now getting into small boats, and I've spoken to a number of them. There's been a wide number of reports on those who are ACRS and ARAP eligible getting into small boats to cross the channel.
So you're saying that because of the inadequacies of this scheme, we have now got people who potentially served with the UK government in Afghanistan,
yes,
now being forced to get on small boats across
exactly
the
right, yes. There is an example of a pilot who was involved in 30 combat missions alongside coalition forces in Afghanistan, who was forced, having waited over a year, was then forced to travel along that well-trodden migration route, very perilous, and then take a small boat across the channel. The number of Afghans now outnumber any other nationality of those crossing by small boats. That, in turn, is leading to the number of deaths in the channel also being predominantly from Afghans. So, yes, there are a number of people who are ARAP, certainly ARAP, and ACRS eligible, who are crossing in small boats.
Neil?
So and I've had constituents say their family will join, or will enter the UK by boat because they cannot use the scheme that should be open to them, and they do qualify. But your fear is that there will be deaths of those who worked for the UK government or were trained by the UK government in the English Channel as a result of the failure to fix the problems that this committee identified last year.
Yes, and there may well be already.
And is there any evidence that the suggestion that you'll be sent to Rwanda is in any way a deterrent to someone getting on a boat in these circumstances?
Absolutely not, no. Every time I travel to northern France, go across the country speaking to people in asylum hotels and elsewhere, in fact, the morning after the Rwanda deal was announced, I was on the Kent coast, I went down to speak to people who had just arrived in small boats, and I said, have you heard of the Rwanda deal? They all said yes. They had all heard of it, they all follow the news reporting, and they had crossed anyway, so it's not a deterrent.
Can I just one further quick question, Chair? Is the government, try to be devil's advocate, the government deserves credit for the Ukraine scheme, deserves credit for the Hong Kong British National Overseas scheme. What do Afghans and others ascribe the difference between those successful schemes and the complete failure with the Afghan scheme? What is seen to be the reason behind that? By those affected, your former colleagues and your friends, neighbours and...
Just shake their head and just say, what's wrong with us Afghans? You know, we were loyal to the UK, we worked for the UK, you know, we potentially will now be put in harm's way because of our association with the UK.
And if I may, it's not very easy to get passport in Afghanistan. Taliban only sell passport with $2,500 if you want to get it faster. So this is like their fight against corruption. Like 2 weeks ago, the passport office opened in Herat province, the same province affected by earthquake a week ago. There were like thousands of people, probably you have seen the photos, Nicola and Andrew, thousands of people queued, men and women, to get passports. 6 million Afghans left Afghanistan since the Taliban take over, taking enormously dangerous routes, waiting in Pakistan and Iran. And we know that the Pakistani and Iranian government announced that they will actually expel Afghans. Even with legal documents, they will send them back, they will deport them to Afghanistan. And these are Afghans who are like really at immediate risk. I know some of the women who are in Pakistan, for instance, they were like the head of departments of gender. They were judges, they were prosecutors, they were female police officers. They are at risk of being deported to Afghanistan.
Forgive me, Fawzia, and that also includes those who are under the care of the British High Commission in Islamabad, whose visas have expired. You know, it touches the UK as well directly.
Their Pakistani and Iranian, as you said, visa is expired. So they keep asking me this question, and I don't really know how to help them. This is like one of the guilt I suffer from, because I left Afghanistan. I wish I didn't leave Afghanistan. And now these people who have walked with me, walked with you through very bumpy roads the last 20 years, they are left there. It's the trauma that we're actually suffering every day.
Can I thank you all ever so much for giving evidence today? I think there are serious concerns a year on from our report that our ability to have some kind of strategic commitment to our partners around the world continues to be undermined, and I question this how it impacts on our ability to partner around the world, to secure the buy-in and support of local communities when we go to countries, and the impact that also has on the safety of our brave men and women in our armed forces who go out there to work, as well as our Foreign Office staff. So can I thank you all for your continued advocacy for all those Afghans who work with the UK and beyond, and particularly Fawzia also for raising the femicide that's taking place in Afghanistan. Thank you all ever so much.
Thank you.
I'm not going to suspend the session in the interest of time. We're going to bring the Minister straight in and continue. Minister, thank you ever so much for joining us today. I recognise it has been a particularly difficult 10 days for you, and I'm grateful where other ministers might have sought to shirk their responsibility to this committee, you have upheld your commitment, so I'm very grateful to you. As you know, today we are talking about where we are with Afghanistan a year on from the committee's report, which found there to be serious failings with the way in which the UK conducted the evacuation and the way in which we have upheld what should have been a commitment to those who had stood by us and helped us as we sought to secure better stability and security for all in Afghanistan. Can I start by asking what you see as the roadmap for the UK's future relationship with Afghanistan, and obviously specifically with the Taliban, and what are our objectives now within Afghanistan?
Firstly, thank you, and I'm glad that the committee has called this particular session. I know there's been previous evidence given as well, but I think it's extremely important. I've been at the Foreign Office a while now, and one thing certainly is important, that we keep certain key issues on the front burner, and there will always be somewhere, tragically, a conflict, a crisis. So therefore I welcome the opportunity to review where we've got to. On the specifics of your question, we've been, since the takeover of the Taliban in August 2021, there's been several areas of our activity, and just very quickly to sort of summarise them. First and foremost, the key objective and the priority was on the humanitarian front. I'm proud to say that over the last sort of the first 18 months after the Taliban takeover, you used the word about staying with our responsibilities, irrespective of where you were on the decision of NATO to withdraw. The important thing was the maximum support that we could extend to the Afghan people who, through no fault of their own, have suddenly had to endure this governance of the Taliban. And on record, I've said it before to this committee and to others, I want to make it absolutely clear from the outset, the Taliban's philosophy is nothing to do with Islam. It's a draconian, subversive philosophy which is against different people, different communities, and as we know, against women and girls in terms of their empowerment. Again, I would add, this is totally against Islam. It's a faith I follow, have grown up with, and it's one that I've seen in my own experience of what it's done as a force for good, and that applies to all faiths and beliefs. So I think that I say right at the outset, because it was important to contextualize what the Taliban's perverse ideology is. And what we've seen since then is a quite draconian application of that philosophy, especially in the context of women and girls, which I'll come on to, I'm sure, in subsequent questions. But we've really stepped up our humanitarian efforts. We were over £500 million in that first 18 months. And the question was on how to ensure that support got through, as we've targeted to at least 50% to girls and women, which is a key objective, and rightly so, that we set at the FCDO. And that was done through working directly with a whole raft of NGOs on the ground, some international NGOs, as well as the UN framework as well. Was it easy? Not at all. I've refrained, and I will refrain again from naming specific organisations, more to protect them and at their request. But we have been working very closely with a number of agencies on that very point to ensure that we can deliver basic food aid. So at that time with the World Food Programme, immediately in the aftermath, we worked directly with the then head of the World Food Programme, David Beasley, to ensure that the requirements were met, as well as other UN agencies, as well as UNICEF. So that's the first element. The second element was about diplomacy and diplomatic engagement. As you know, we don't have a mission on the ground. Nevertheless, we set up a mission in Doha, which has been important. Do we have a relationship with the Taliban? We do at official levels. We've engaged at the senior most diplomatic level, and Andy's here with me as well, and he will speak to that. But through our heads of mission, that has been an important link, both in assessing the situation on the ground, but also when it comes to more sensitive situations. Some of you, I'm sure, have followed that there was a very delicate and long negotiation on certain detainees in Afghanistan. I myself was involved with that, and I pay tribute to our amazing teams both here in London, but particularly in Doha, the diplomats who were engaging quite directly with the Taliban on this negotiation. And that could not have been achieved had that channel not been open. And the third element, just to also talk about, is, of course, those who were seeking to leave, eligible Afghans who were leaving Afghanistan. I pay tribute again to some of the neighbouring countries, particularly Pakistan, which through real challenge domestically,
we'll come back to Pakistan.
I'm sure we will, but we shouldn't forget what they have done in the last 18 months. We would not have achieved a certain buffer if that had not happened. And we are engaging, continuing, despite the changes in Pakistan, but also Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. I myself, you'll remember, Chair, went to the region several times, and it was that direct diplomacy that allowed us to share information which allowed for the access of individuals.
Thank you.
That said, the situation is ever evolving, and that diplomacy is still important when it comes to the rights of individuals within Afghanistan, particularly women and girls. And in that respect, there has been an extensive amount of work done within their neighbours to Afghanistan, but also with the wider Islamic world. And I've also worked, as you will be aware, with the United Nations directly, and most namely the likes of Sima Dabous, the head of UN Women, and also under Secretary General, who's head of development, but has been led on this, Amina Mohammed, who themselves at my behest and advocacy actually also visited Afghanistan, and I hope there'll be an opportunity to discuss those points as well. But I hope that gives you a flavour of the different elements that we've been engaged with.
Henry, before I turn to Henry, a quick question. You mentioned Qatar there. Can I just ask what our strategic objectives are when they come to Qatar? Because it has been home to both Hamas and the Taliban. How many more enemies does Qatar need to shore up before we start questioning what our strategic implications are and our priorities are with them?
Well, I think with many countries around the world, there will be certain countries that have direct diplomatic engagements with both administrations that we don't share the same beliefs with. I mean, let's not also forget.
Organisations, not
I'll come on to that.
administrations.
But And in this particular case, the role of Qatar, both in the current crisis, which I know you requested a private briefing on as well as the role that they've played in terms of some of the key areas of our priorities, particularly when we were seeking to get eligible Afghans out of Afghanistan. Qatar actually played a very important role, as did the UAE. Now, in terms of our objectives, Qatar, of course, is a partner. There are many things that we disagree when it comes to these particular issues. However, they do play an important diplomatic role when it comes to engaging with those organisations where perhaps we will not have a direct link, including the two that you've mentioned.
I'm sure we'll come back to it. Henry, please.
Chair, thank you very much indeed. Minister, thank you for appearing before the Foreign Affairs Committee. I appreciate that obviously it was essentially a US policy-led decision, but what do you think the impact has been and the nature of the withdrawal in August 2021 on British influence in the region?
Well, I think there's two elements to that, Henry. First is the role of NATO itself. That, there were objectives that we went in on, and we all remember those dreadful events which led to the intervention and indeed NATO's intervention in Afghanistan. And if I was to be quite straightforward, there is that feeling of we went a complete circle. Were their objectives achieved? Of course, during the 20 years of our engagement, there were positive moves forward in terms of empowerment and education of girls, the empowerment of women. We saw society, not across the board, but changing in a positive way. And when the decisions were taken, and I'm not going to play back other sessions we've had with the committee, once those strategic decisions were taken and at the speed at which they were taken, and I would also say the then president, when he departed on that fateful day of the 15th of August 2021, as one particular minister, who I won't name here, within the then Afghanistan administration has said to me, the whole sense of leadership was lost because there was no one there, and the whole sense of purpose with the Taliban moving forward into Kabul. And I think many of the gains that we were able to achieve, particularly on the rights of minorities, on the rights of women and girls, the progress we saw in education, there was a real setback on what we had achieved. And that's been reflected and evidenced by what we've seen in the subsequent 2 and a bit years since then. It's a sense of, I think, deep reflection and regret for many who operated as part of that NATO team. I understand, that operations come to an end. But I think the nature of a disengagement, the issue of instability within the region, and you use that important word, influence, I think that remains something that we need to work on. And I think on our equities that we have on the humanitarian side, our continued engagement on some of the diplomatic levers that we have has been important to reassert the fact that whilst NATO has departed, that the United Kingdom still regards Afghanistan as an important priority.
And if I may, a brief supplementary on that point about the United Kingdom still remaining engaged. What damage do you think the nature of the withdrawal just over 2 years has done to the UK's future programmes engaging not just in Afghanistan but in other parts of the region, indeed the world?
I would use the word damage. I think we've had to reassess prioritisation. But one thing I would say in a very general sense, and I don't mean this because I am a minister at the Foreign Office, but I see myself when I travel to various parts of the world in multilateral fora, notwithstanding many of the challenges and conflicts that currently exist around the world, the United Kingdom is still regarded as an important partner. It's regarded very highly in terms of our diplomacy and engagement and our ability to convene. And I think those are important assets that we should not just sustain but strengthen. So of course, when you have the kind of crisis we've seen unfurling in Afghanistan, that presents an immense challenge, not just to us but a number of our NATO partners. But it's equally important that what we have shown, notwithstanding the strategic decision, that we remain engaged. And I do not believe, and I mean this on a principled and through my own experience, that we've seen a declining influence of British diplomacy. If anything, on many of the conflicts and challenges we face, there's a real call for seeing an increased level of British engagement.
Thank you.
Robert.
Yeah, thank you. Lord Ahmed, thank you very much for appearing before us. I'm guesting, as it were, on behalf of the Defence Committee. So I'd just like to ask you some questions from a slightly different perspective. You mentioned the nature of the disengagement just then, and I think we have to accept that the nature of the disengagement, however one looks at it, constitutes a major failure of intelligence and medium-term planning. And a worse disaster can only be seen to have been avoided because of the extraordinary performance of, in particular, the Royal Air Force and the Parachute Regiment in really pulling the iron from the fire in Operation Pitting. Now, given that's the case, and given that you've had chance to reflect upon this, and given the fact that that extraordinary performance came at enormous cost to people and platforms, could I ask you what lessons you've learned on the intelligence failures and on the planning failures between MOD and FCDO? And above all, can you comment on the logistics and airlift capability that the UK would need in such a scenario?
First of all, thanks, Robert. On the issue of plans that were in place and the issue of disengagement, if we go back to those particular events, albeit briefly, there were changing timelines. There were contingency plans in place and the coordination was in place. But I think the speed of the Taliban takeover, you referred to the issue of intelligence. Even the Afghan administration or parts of it, I think, were surprised. And this was, as you rightly say, an opportunity to really reassess about how the different scenarios, as we're doing currently in any crisis, be it in the Middle East or on Russia-Ukraine, scenarios will play out. And I think there has been a real learning on that in terms of better coordination and recognition. Secondly, the reliance
on that, though, forgive me, because I without wishing to revisit, you know, I appreciate that there was a speed that took people by surprise, but that's what planning's for.
Of course it is. But of course it is. You know, Robert, I can speak. Yeah, but I can speak. You know, first of all, were there plans in place? There were plans in place because the ability to stand up certain elements of that logistical exercise would not have happened. The United Kingdom assisted 36 countries in terms of their exiting of their nationals and their individuals from that country. That would not have happened if plans were not in place. I'm not saying they were the best plans or we haven't learned from them.
I'm not wishing to be unfair. Yeah. I'm seeking to ask what lessons have been learned.
Yeah, which I'll come on to. And I think we then move forward onto what's happened subsequently. I think some of the lessons we've learned in terms of our own internal processes at the FCDO, in terms of the engagement across government. I know I worked that crisis and I pay tribute to the then Home Secretary. I pay tribute to my good friend and colleague, the Minister of Armed Forces, where individual relationships mattered, where the working of phones. This wasn't, with the best planning, something that could take weeks and days. When the crisis and the Taliban takeover had taken over Kabul, this was a minute by minute. Decisions needed to be made quickly. And I think those lessons of the urgency and the ability that cross-government working also needs to have the dynamism to respond to crisis, I think we have seen reflected in how we've dealt with both on an intelligence front, but also in a logistical front when it's come to subsequent issues. The Russian illegal war on Ukraine is reflective of that. We're embedded in terms of cohesive and strategic structures in terms of how government departments work together, also working together in terms of first responders, in terms of what requirements are, in terms of briefing to parliamentarians and colleagues. Earlier today I was with the Foreign Secretary briefing on the Middle East to parliamentarians. I think so. In short, yes, there's been lessons learned both internally in terms of processes and structures and how we seek to mitigate better, in terms of intelligence here, which you mentioned quite specifically, but also in terms of strategic working with other key partners to ensure there's a diplomatic track, there's a humanitarian track, let's take the example of Russia-Ukraine. On the atrocities that we've seen committed over many years, I also lead on the issue of preventing sexual violence in conflict, which is really close to my heart, and it has been for many years. Our response as Ukraine has been really based on the experiences of conflicts past, that we're working now with the likes of the International Criminal Court, for example, on ensuring structures, processes, procedures are set up. The training is provided now in terms of internal mechanisms to Ukraine to ensure that when we hope this war ends at the earliest opportunity, the structures and the accountability mechanisms are also set up. So there is a great deal of learning which we've been able to apply to Ukraine, and also in the crisis in Sudan, understanding who has the best equities on the ground at a given time of crisis, who has which best resource on the ground, and to ensure that the government-to-government working with different partners is also in place, and that there are open channels of communication. And we were able to achieve that in terms of logistics. You, like myself, have been an aviation minister previously, and it's not just easy to go out and say we need a charter flight tomorrow. It doesn't work like that. You know, you need to plan ahead. So in the current crisis that we're going through, the crisis that we've had subsequently when we're seeking, when we were doing the COVID response, for example, as well, I think we learn from each crisis and how we then subsequently deal with issues.
What specifically did you learn for Civair and Greytail then, arising out of pitting that was then applied in Sudan and other crises?
Well, I think the issue of coordination with partners is key in terms of our liaison we have, who has what equity in place, exactly where in terms of logistics, and also that events, that there have to be contingencies to the contingencies, if I could put that in that way, that a certain area, that the mechanics of government need to be dynamic to the response times, which can change quite quickly. And I think in operation prior to pitting, the plans that were in place, and the fact that pitting happened, the numbers of people we got out wasn't by accident, but there were lots of logistic issues on the ground there that we were dealing with, the closure of gates particularly, and then the intelligence that was coming through on different issues, including the attacks around the hotels at that time. I think all those add into that the sharing of information, sometimes it has to be done more discreetly, sometimes it has to be done at a very high level, that we have enhanced forms of communication. If there was one thing I think we need to, going back to that time, and this is my personal view, is ensuring that all strategic options are exhausted even before that key strategic decision is made. And whilst I may have been a particular voice in government, at times not a prevailing voice, I think it's important that we give due consideration to all the contingencies that we're planning for, and then effectively resourcing them appropriately as well.
Do you have a view on that effective resource? I.e., do we have the capacity now that we had then? Was it adequate? Is it adequate?
Well, I think every crisis brings different challenge. You will have the ability to have greater number of specialists, for example, on issues of atrocity prevention. How can you have better and more able coordinated action when it comes to humanitarian support? Every crisis can be different. But when it comes to war and conflict, of course, there's some immediate actions. And I do believe the resourcing is more effective. I do believe, notwithstanding some of the challenges which remain with the merger of any organisation, that having your development and diplomacy arms working very closely together is important, but also an enhanced level of coordination with our colleagues across the road at the Ministry of Defence.
Thank you. Graham, I know you wanted to go more into the consular.
I'll just ask two quick questions because you've answered some of my questions. Just following Robert's questions very specifically about Sudan, it appears that lessons weren't learned in Sudan, that other countries' embassies took action beforehand. They seem to have knowledge that the two warlords in Sudan were going to set about each other, whereas we did nothing or little, and the plans to get people out of the country were poor. So would you accept that the lessons weren't learned in Sudan?
No, I wouldn't, and I'll tell you why. I think, of course, there's always going to be things you can do better. We actually played a very active role. I talked earlier of countries that have equities on the ground. So I know from my own experience, I work very closely with the Saudis in terms of ensuring our access. The contingency planning enabled the establishment very quickly of, not only was our crisis centre enabled, we were able to respond with a much larger pool of crisis-trained staff. There were new policies and programs we were able to put in place. And the other thing, as compared to other countries, we had a much more spread and a larger number of British nationals who were spread across the country rather than in a single space, as did several of our European partners, had less people, but they were in a more concentrated zone. So I think those added elements did provide for an added challenge. But we did, in terms of the sourcing I talked earlier of, the ability where we were getting people out from Port Sudan, were there flights and contingencies arranged, for example, in Cyprus. We had that set up to arrange for evacuees who were coming through. And to stand up a large-scale evacuation, I think we did learn the lessons of what happened in Afghanistan and applied them in Sudan. I'm not saying it was a perfect response, and there's always lessons to be learned from that. But certainly I think there were specific, and being live to that, particularly on the diplomacy side, that we were able to engage more effectively and directly. Andy, you may want to add to that.
Well, perhaps just a